Colleagues and friends, good morning.
Good morning, Scott.
I'm from the South. That's not going to cut it. Good morning. That's pretty good. And welcome to your 2025 Natural Hazards Workshop Plenary. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles, and it's my honor to moderate what I know will be a conversation full of insight and ideas passionately held. The title of the plenary is Disasters as Turning Points, and the charge to your panelists was to address the following questions. What is a disaster that you see as a crucial historical turning point? What lessons were available but not learned from that turning point, and maybe what was learned? And looking back from today, how do you see this turning point now? I'm about to introduce your brilliant panelists, and each is going to talk for a little bit at the top of our session from their own unique perspective. And then we will turn to a conversation. Because of the restrictions of time today and giving our panelists plenty of time to have conversation, we won't have questions from the floor, but you can participate in this session. The same questions that our panelists were charged to answer are available as poll questions in the Whova app. I don't work for the app, but the app is great for this, and if you want to go into the app and find the poll and give some feedback to the questions that our panelists are answering this morning, please do that, and during the session I will try to highlight some of your answers and get some perspective on those from our panelists if we have time. But even if you don't do that during this session, because if you're like me, you might struggle a little bit with the app, do it later in the workshop, because we'll be collecting these answers throughout the workshop and they will become part of the basis of some writing that will come together later on. So please do participate in that way. Okay, with that, I'd like to introduce your panelists briefly, and of course you can go into the website to see the totality of their amazing work. So just a brief introduction for each. Walt Gillis Peacock is Professor of Urban Planning in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Urban Planning. He's also the Sandy and Brian Mitchell Master Builder Endowed Chair and a Senior Fellow at the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center of Texas A&M University. He's also Editor-in-Chief of the International Journal of Mass Emergencies and Disasters. Kathleen Tierney is Professor Emerita in the Department of Sociology and a research professor and fellow in the Institute of Behavioral Science, University of Colorado Boulder. As we heard earlier, from 2003 to 2016, she served as the director of the Natural Hazards Center. Shirley Laska, Professor Emerita of Sociology at the University of New Orleans, created the Center for Hazards Assessment, Response, and Technology, CHART. Over its 23 years, CHART has served a large cadre of master's and doctoral students who appreciate both hazards, risk assessment, and reduction through collaboration with communities. Lauren Alexander Augustine is the Executive Director for the Gulf Research Program of the National Academies. She's responsible for overseeing all aspects of the management and use of the criminal settlement funds from the Deepwater Horizon disaster that were entrusted with the National Academies by the federal government. And not least, Fernando I. Rivera is a professor of sociology and director of the Puerto Rico Research Hub at the University of Central Florida. His research interests and activities are in the sociology of health, medical sociology, disasters, and race and ethnicity. So with that, I would like to invite our first speaker up. So each is going to give a brief presentation, and then we'll turn to conversation. Walt, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so it's impossible for me to, in 7 minutes, cover everything that I would like to cover. So just going to throw out some incomplete thoughts and ideas that kind of help us with at least our overall conversation. And of course, I'm going to talk about Hurricane Andrew. One of the truisms, at least through my life, and I've been extraordinarily lucky to be able to work with a lot of colleagues that are a hell of a lot smarter than I am, that really made research possible. And this is just a small sampling of some of the folks that I was able to work with. It was the first time I actually got a job at a place where they actually wanted a disaster researcher and stuff. And then Hurricane Andrew happened, and they really wanted that. But an incredible team of folks. Betty and Hugh have been here for many, many years, off and on. And Nikki is here someplace as well too. Elaine Anderson is up the road. She's not here, but and other graduate students that have really continued to make things possible. Again, just a small group, but something that we all need to consider. We all need to be working in groups, rely on each other, rely on our strengths, and bring those together to really deal with and address these issues. Additionally, we need funding too, right? And so that just is a list of the different grants that we cobble together to actually make this happen as well too and stuff. So some of the big, I think, changes and maybe really accentuating things that are already going on out there as well too and stuff. So, I mean, gender and disaster, Betty and Elaine were just instrumental at really interjecting that and making it a major part of the research efforts. And then after that, the Gender Disaster Network and the like really began to take off, and they were just so instrumental at doing that work as well. Issues, of course, of race and ethnicity. I mean, if you think of Bob Boland and Trish Bolton, and there were others that were beginning and doing some of that work as well, but we were fortunately able to really move that forward as well and link those things to really look at those pre-existing conditions and how they shape what happened, as well as what the long-term recovery process is as well. GIS, these very primitive GIS maps you could see up there, we were able to kind of really link that together. And Nikki Dash and Linda Beer were two of the graduate students that were working. FEMA saw them and then hired them from us, so we lost our graduate students and set up one of the first GIS field offices to actually monitor what was happening with FEMA as well too. And then, of course, the work on housing recovery, taking the work that Mary Camario and others had done and really trying to kind of build on that work and look at those inequities in terms of housing and the like. And I think has stimulated an awful lot of research, but also we are nowhere near where we need to be, especially in terms of rental housing, multifamily housing, and those kinds of issues as well, too. If we look at practice, I think FEMA, especially with respect to Hurricane Andrew, really began to change, its definition of households, who could get funded, the problems with that funding, especially when it went to an over-testosterone male that was head of household and screwed everything up. So it really began to kind of change some of those things. The whole issue of post-disaster housing, these were one of the last times that we had those major issues in terms of the creation of those temporary housing places that created all kinds of problems as well. But mitigation, from that point on, with James Lee Witt, we saw FEMA really investing and states investing on those issues, and we saw a run for at least 7, maybe 8 years, and then, as Kathleen will talk about, things changed. Building codes, Florida really basically had a terrible set of building codes that development interests kept watering down, and we saw, really good, solid science work on that and how to increase that, and those changes happening in Florida. Still not happening in many other places in our country, and we still have a hell of a long way to go, especially with respect to flood issues. Insurance, I spent lots of time looking at the inequities and redlining and problems with insurance, but insurance was also an incredibly dynamic and active part of that recovery process as well, too. At the time, wind was covered by a normal homeowner policy. Now we see that's not covered in many places, and they've tried to withdraw from those markets. But even then, in 1993, climate change, sea level rise, and the issues were already on the table and already being discussed. We still have not addressed those issues, and now we're turned away from many of those issues as well, too. And the vitality of community-based organizations. We Will Rebuild was kind of the initial efforts. It was all the old white historical power elite in Miami, and that began to change. And then Women Will Rebuild really came and challenged everything that was going on in those issues. And we saw those incorporate together, and changes that occurred in terms of the nature of that recovery process and where funds, especially private sector funds, that couldn't go like private sector funds that could go to places that were not possible for federal funds and as well as for state funds. Centro Campesino was an incredible farm workers organization that made it possible, gave voices to those that did not have voices, challenged insurance industry, challenged the like as well too. One of the terrible things is a lot of that social infrastructure really emerged because of innovative funding opportunities that actually made that happen. And oftentimes, Texas drives me crazy, a lot, in terms of how suppresses those opportunities to actually have funding mechanisms that can go to grassroots organizations, that can go to different housing organizations, and actually bring about change as well, too. So we need much, much more of that, and we still have a hell of a long way to go in terms of those issues. So she's about to hold up a stop sign. I'm going to stop, and we can continue the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Today, I'm wearing my name tag. This was the name tag that got researchers into places after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 in New York City. This got me into the EOC and into FEMA's headquarters as well. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, involving hijacked planes that crashed into the two towers of the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and near a town in Pennsylvania, were the largest ever terrorist attacks on U.S. soil. The research community responded immediately after the attacks. Under Dennis Milletti's leadership at the Natural Hazard Center, the center funded more than 20 quick response projects, an effort that resulted in the 600-page compilation called Beyond September 11th, an account of post-disaster research. On the day of the attacks, I was at a meeting at the Multidisciplinary Center for Earthquake Engineering Research at SUNY Buffalo, State University of New York at Buffalo. And so I was away from my home base, which at that time was the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware. But nevertheless, we were able to field a team to go to New York City and look at the response within one day. And I just want to give a shout out to Jim Kendra, who is not here, and Tricia Wachtendorf, who really led that effort. There were many other research activities that went on subsequently. For example, Columbia University's School of Public Health did a comprehensive study of the evacuation of the trade towers. The National Institute of Standards and Technology launched a full-scale investigation looking at various dimensions of 9/11. And of course, this research resulted in a very large number of published papers and dissertations and books like those that you see up on the screen. Focusing on New York City, one key research finding that has been borne out many times in disasters had to do with the extent of improvisation and creativity that marked the response. Now, in addition to destroying the trade towers of the World Trade Center, the attacks also destroyed World Trade Center number 7, which housed the Emergency Operations Center for New York City. So with the loss of workspace, plans, communications, mapping technology, and other resources, the city had to start from scratch and reestablish its Emergency Operations Center in a new space, ultimately in Pier 92, with the help of many converging volunteers. Also improvised were the information hub at the Jacob Javits Convention Center, where people who were searching for their loved ones could go to find out about them. The plan for the removal of debris from the attack sites down at Ground Zero. The procedures that were established at the Fresh Kills landfill on Staten Island for the criminal investigation, and also helping to identify the belongings of the people who perished in the attack. So responders at all levels of government acted creatively and improvisationally in the face of almost unimaginable death and destruction. Improvisation was always also evident in the response of members of the general public. For example, with no pre-planning and with no direct orders, operators of tourist ships and other watercraft organized themselves to evacuate an estimated 500,000 people from Lower Manhattan to other destinations. And notably at the time, there was no social media as we know it today, and even the use of mobile phones was not all that common at that time, but they coordinated. They improvised. In contrast with the largely positive and productive responses on the part of local and state authorities and FEMA and other federal agencies and the public at large, the federal policy response to 9/11 was disproportionate and misguided. A classic case of what Karen Cheff and Chip Clark referred to as elite panic, right? While local agencies and the general public responded in ways that were appropriate, the federal policy system responded in ways that were not. Let's take a brief look at that response. Now, some measures, like locking the door to the cockpit of an airplane, were quite sensible, quite effective, and cost-effective. But consider some of these other policy responses. Forming the Department of Homeland Security, okay. Subsuming FEMA under DHS, not okay, maybe. Making enormous expenditures on terrorism-related issues, which experts subsequently determined were far in excess of the actual threat levels. Requiring local communities to reorient their planning away from natural and technological hazards and toward planning for exotic terrorism agents that had never been used before and haven't been used since. Ignoring decades of research on the public's response to disasters and substituting myths about public behavior like panic and social unrest that we were always arguing were not true. On top of that, the public policy response also involved curtailing civil liberties, rendering people to black sites for what was called enhanced interrogation, otherwise known as torture, and the worst by far, starting the devastating wars against Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, many members of our research community decried these misguided policies. I'm just one example among many in our community. After the attacks, I submitted a piece to the Social Science Research Council website. I testified before Congress. I gave talks. I published articles on why the preoccupation with terrorism was eroding the nation's preparedness for other kinds of disasters. At the behest of Wayne Blanchard, I even gave a talk at the FEMA Higher Education Conference criticizing what I called the 9/12 people, the people who thought that the laws of nature were repealed on September the 12th. A talk, by the way, that was not well received. Fortunately, moral panics tend to be challenged by obdurate reality, and that's what happened 4 years later when Katrina struck the Gulf Coast and New Orleans. Suddenly, natural hazards were back on the agenda.
Good morning. You have all received this in your packet. Is this mic okay? I want to call attention to this document because it is a group of research projects that were done after Katrina, but they were done in a very unusual way. Not everyone, but many of the authors of the books that are the Katrina shelf had been meeting for years at professional conferences to talk about disasters. So when the hurricane happened, we immediately went into a, organized path of trying to understand what our roles would be with regard to research. The outcome, and it was led by Lori Peek and Kai Erickson, who's one of the founders of this discipline, with his book, Everything in Its Path, about the floods in West Virginia, were the leaders of putting the thoughts and organizing and the research together to produce this series of publications. So I encourage you to consider buying them, but I'm really wanting you to go to Lowlander Center, our website, in a couple of weeks to see I'm doing the write-up of that process. And I asked Lori if she thought that any other disaster had been populated by researchers who had all gathered beforehand, and she doesn't think there is. So this may be a very unique situation, and I strongly encourage that those of you who are in disaster studies have meetings at your regular conferences. We did the ASA, we did social problems, we did rurals, and we did southerns. We were never on the agenda. We agreed to the time and place, and we met, and we talked about the work we were doing, never imagining that it would be the groundwork for the research that was done for Katrina. So I didn't get time off from my presentation for that. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. This is my personal story, as well as the story of many, many thousands of others who were in the reach of Hurricane Katrina. 20 years ago, in March 2025, I attended a meeting on the 2004 hurricane season at the National Academy of Sciences. Okay. I sat next to a man who I was to learn was an engineer specializing in preventing storm damage to structures, particularly houses. He was in his first year as chief engineer at the Institute of Business and Home Safety, IBHS. You may already have heard of this organization from its attendance here at the workshop. About a month before Hurricane Katrina struck in August, as Walt was referring to, I was informed by Lloyd's of London affiliates that my homeowner's policy was non-renewable due to risk of a hurricane in New Orleans. The Lloyd's folks actually came to the university and interviewed the professors who would have expertise on it. I sought the supplementary state insurance program, but to qualify, I had to replace my roof. Thankfully, I recalled my March seatmate, Tim Reinhold. I reached out to him. He agreed to give my roofer instructions via phone for constructing a resilient roof, and the roofer explained them to his Spanish-speaking crew. When I was able to return to my neighborhood weeks after Katrina struck to investigate my home's damage, I viewed the outside. No apparent damage, but a huge pecan tree had fallen on the top of the roof. This decision was not to fortify the, I'm sorry, I beg your pardon. Okay. All right, now I have to do this. All right, so this is pre-Katrina. Now, this one is after Katrina. We can see that the blue tarps placed over damaged roofs by the Corps of Engineers emphasized the importance of roofs to protect structures from harm and thus the people who occupy them. This aerial view formed the dramatic reminder of the event that Lori Peek recalled to me when she invited me to participate on the panel. There were 1 million homes damaged by Hurricane Katrina, half within Louisiana, and mine, a fortified roof, was not. I'm sorry, I just skipped the paragraph. I walked into the house, turned the key, walked in, and there was no damage whatsoever, absolutely none. Devastation all around my home. And after the tree was lifted from my house in December, I had the same fear, went into the house, and there was no damage. The pathway of Hurricane Ida went directly over Pointe du Chien. I'm sorry, I'm having a problem with my paging here. Okay. Grand Bayou, repair of the structures damaged in hurricane pass is undertaken by commercial roofers and by volunteers. After Hurricane Katrina, one very committed faith-based construction team repaired the homes of the indigenous tribe, the Atakapat Ishak Shawasha, living in the marsh of Grand Bayou near the tip of the Mississippi River. Before they began the repair, the tribal elders who led the community's efforts to recover asked if the volunteers would do a fortified roof on their damaged homes. That's the kind that I got. The volunteer leaders said, absolutely not. This was mainly due to the cost and not knowing the details of such repair techniques, nor an appreciation of the weakness of normal repair. Many more reasons for this failure are part of my comments. This decision not to fortify the roof would prove to strike a second major damage blow to Grand Bayou when in 2021, 16 years after Katrina, Hurricane Ida powerfully struck the community. You can see how horrible it was. Okay. Similarly, it struck a sister tribe, Pointe du Chien, some 35 miles west. Without fortified roofs, Grand Bayou was damaged again, as it had been for Katrina. The pathway of the eye of Hurricane Ida went directly over Pointe du Chien. The village was in the storm's worst winds for 5 hours. Some who stayed, not in the tribe, but others, held doors shut for that long. All of the structures were destroyed or severely damaged as to be uninhabitable, all but one. The greenhouse was unscathed. Guess who designed it? Tim Reinhold from the American Academy meeting. Tim had been working with us, the Lowlander Center, and coastal communities on and off since he guided my roofer a month before Katrina. Just before Hurricane Ida struck Pointe du Chien in August 2021, he designed, in collaboration with Christina Peterson, the director of the center, the new indigenous plant greenhouse for the tribe. Again, as was the case with my home in Katrina, not a bit of damage from Hurricane Ida other than the window screens fell off. Not a bit. When one of the leaders of the construction crew of the same faith group that had repaired Grand Bayou after Katrina in 2005 without using fortified principles contacted the Pointe du Chien, the tribal leaders asked them the very same question the Grand Bayou elders had asked in 2005. Will you build to fortified standards? This time, the construction leader replied, we will not repair if we don't. Your homes unless we use the fortified standards. Okay. All right. On a day, late March this spring, following a winter of fortified construction, just before the Mennonite construction crews went back to the Midwest to plant their crops, the 7 new fortified homes in Pointe-aux-Chenes were viewed by the residents who would occupy them, by other community members, public officials from the parish, and county, other faith and volunteer groups and members. Their sturdiness was fully evident. All fortified methods had been applied. You might want to go to the website entitled Rebuilding Pointe-aux-Chenes to see the tribe's reaction to their fortified homes. Totally 100% committed to the concept. Attending the celebration, attendees then celebrated the fortified homes. The luncheon was in the Baptist Church Sanctuary in Pointe-aux-Chenes Bayou. The way in which this gathering honored fortified construction is the way in which our society, and especially those in the broad geographic areas subject to strong winds, hurricanes, and tornadoes, should treat this effort. And with climate change exacerbating the prospect of severe weather, even a wider breadth of the country should pay homage and effort to fortified construction. The Institute of Business and Home Safety has developed fortified construction techniques. Since Hurricane Katrina, Smart Home America especially has been successful, especially in Alabama, in achieving fortified construction. Coastal universities are teaching students and the communities. Other volunteers in the lowlander are assisting. Individual activists committed to fortified construction also make a difference. And others are also raising funds to achieve the standards, local, regional, and national organizations. One unexpected, from which we got quite a good award, is the National Low-Income Housing Coalition that is highly respected. You can see the linkage between fortified and retaining housing. I know that many of you are applied disaster professionals. I advocate that you enhance your work by combining your applied practice with continual assessment of what works when you try to educate and recruit community members to disaster mitigation. Second here, sorry. Sometimes we can say more often than we should, our American society pays homage to the wrong things. Being carefree, nothing bad will happen, and if it does, someone will fix it. Taking risks, little concern for being attentive to protecting our communities, our homes, inadequate concern for the protection of those in our society who can't make up for the harm done by the risk-taking leaders too, and that I think is a critical issue. And in fact, the risk we are taking with climate change is a challenge of our and our future generations' failure to make a commitment to safety, to disaster mitigation. Perhaps we should just take a minute to pay, okay, here. I will end with this slide. While the statistics may vary depending on which credible organization quotes them, because there's quite a few that are different, I want you to pay attention to the ratio. 75,000 is the approximate number of fortified roofs that we have in this country now. Hurricane Katrina harmed 1 million. I think we have some work to do. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, since I missed the opening, I'm Lauren Alexander Augustine, National Academy of Sciences, Gulf Research Program. Boom! Anyone remember where they were April 10th, 2010? April 20th, April 2010. Anyone remember where they were? Anyone know what this is? This is the BP oil spill explosion. This is the iconic imagery of this oil spill. And usually when people say, well, what do you do? And I say, oh, I run this fund that came from the BP oil spill. They're like, oh, yeah. And then all the recollection is kind of vague after that. And I want to just talk for the next 6 minutes or so about how this was maybe a turning point. But this is a different kind of disaster. Now, I work in the same places that Katrina and Ida ripped through. And it's a different kind of disaster, so the turning point is slightly different. But it does have a unique dimension in this journey through American disasters. Okay, 11 people died. And this is something that at our program we hold very deep because we have an opportunity because of 11 lives and families being shattered, and we hold that as a deep responsibility for this money. 4.9 million gallons of water or oil spilled out of the Macondo well, about 32 miles off Louisiana coast, for 87 days. So it started in April, and it was declared sealed in September. And it was like, you clean up an oil spill, and the next day, it's back. It was like that, right? And so 4.9 million gallons of oil is about, 4.9 million barrels of oil is about 210 million gallons of oil, which is about 5 Olympic swimming pools of oil. It's hard to get your head around that, right? That oil, it went everywhere. It spilled off of Louisiana. This is a shoreline in Alabama. And here are shorelines in Barataria Bay, Louisiana, a national wildlife refuge with the Sneakers in Alabama, a random boot print anywhere on the Gulf Coast, and in Pascagoula, Mississippi. People saw oil everywhere on their coastlines. Fish kills, marine mammals, heartbreak across the Gulf. And it wasn't just the things that died, the organisms that died. It was also a loss of a way of life. Shrimping, blackfish, tuna. I love this image. It was in a community in Louisiana. This is what they felt they lost by all that oil spilling out in the Gulf. A spill that really nobody saw except for that iconic image, right? And so the question is out there. What do you do with that much oil? What do you do with an oil spill that you clean up 18,000 gallons a day, and the next day you go to work and guess what you have? A whole new oil spill because the well kept going. So what do you do with it? Well, you can burn it. Now, people actually don't like it when they see plumes of smoke like that off their coast. They're like, that doesn't look good. That's a controlled burn, but you gotta do something with the oil. You can boom it, you can try to contain it, which gets an efficiency of 3% of the oil. So you can also break that stuff up and try to disperse it. I'm gonna talk a little bit about dispersants. This was the most controversial decision in the Deepwater Horizon event. It's highly toxic, and you can see the different headlines here. It saved responders' lives, and then this orange one says it probably did more harm than good. There's nothing easy about dispersants, but it is an option with that much oil. So here's an image you might see. This was a still taken from a video of what the oil was looking like as it was spilling, as it was just gushing out. And while everyone's trying to figure out to disperse it or burn it or boom it at the surface, someone had to figure out how to stop this thing, right? In sense of scale, so here it looks like a nice little pipe, and all we gotta do is put a little cover on the pipe, put a capping stack on it, we're gonna stop the thing. This is a capping stack. It's roughly the size of a Walmart, okay? It's a 4-story building. If you can see for scale, there's pickup trucks and people. And so it's like a 4-story building that has to go from land, this is in Port Aransas, Texas, onto a ship, out to the ocean, where it has to then be lowered to fit on a pipe just so to cap the oil. It has to go 2 miles of water and then another mile under the surface of that. This is engineering magic going on, right? But this is what it took. When we think about some of the legacy infrastructure and what's actually in the Gulf, We're talking about the black lines here. Those are linear pipelines. It's roughly 30,000 linear miles of pipeline in the Gulf of now America, but then the Gulf of Mexico, which is 6 times around the Earth at the equator, right? The red dots are platforms, and that's Deepwater Horizon. It is like watching the risk build over time because all these rigs, platforms, and pipelines are just sitting out there. So, was this a turning point? And I'm gonna say yes, but not in the way that some of these other more public disasters were. This, like I said, it happened largely out of sight, 30 miles out in the middle of the ocean. It had responsible parties. BP, that stands for British Petroleum, and Transocean, they owned this stuff, and they were held responsible, and they were fined an eye-popping criminal settlements north of $60 billion, and that was the turning point. Because every major and medium-sized oil producer in this country and in the world were like, hold on, we also could get fined that much if we don't get our safety together. And so they collaborated, they started working together, and there was a lot, thanks to the Department of Justice as well as BP itself, of investment in science around oil spills. So, what did we not quite learn? What do we still need to know? Dispersants, dispersants, dispersants. Listen, we don't have these spills of national significance very often, thankfully, and we use dispersants even less often than that, thankfully. But there's a big question out there, because you saw all those red dots. Any one of them could blow a Macondo, any one of them. And I'm gonna stop, because I was told to stop, but dispersants. The other thing is the role of communities. We saw people, regular people out there on the coastline picking up oil with their bare hands, walking through it. What is the role of communities? Baseline data, something like that happens. The first question is, what effect did it have on blank? Shrimp, seafood, my house. We may not know if we don't know what it was before the thing, so baseline data, and then finally, this question of legacy infrastructure. How do we deal with those red dots and black lines in the Gulf? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to start with thanking Lori Peak for the invitation to be in the panel and for her leadership and your commitment. And to my fellow panelists, for me, it's a true honor to have shared the stage with you. So one of the things, with the 420 seconds that I was allocated with, is trying to pack as much information as I can. And I'm sort of bringing a little bit of the work that we've done, but I want to give you sort of the visual representation of what Hurricane Maria did represent it for a lot of people in Puerto Rico, but here. So if you see this piece of work here, this is from an artist from Puerto Rico called Antonio Martorell. And this is an exhibition, this is a work that was bought by the Rollins Museum in Winter Park, Florida. If you see kind of like in the upper right hand, it says, ¿Qué es la que? Which is like, ¿Qué es la que hay, right? It's like, what's up? My fellow Puerto Ricans in the crowd can understand that. But if you see out here, at the bottom, it said, Esquela. And esquela means obituary. So if you look at this, these are paper cutouts of newspaper obituaries that were sort of put together out here for the island and the towns of Vieques and Culebra out here. So in looking at that, one of the two things I wanted to bring up in terms of that, right, and a lot of the research that was done out there is by young colleagues that are here in the crowd, and some other collaborators are here in the crowd, and even we had a project from the National Academies of Science Gulf Research Program, great call, Lauren, in terms of that. But one of the things out here, in kind of like looking at these issues of compounding disasters, right? And I put sort of Hurricane Maria sort of in the middle of it, right, as a turning point. And I'm gonna read to you, and this shows an ongoing stream of disasters and emphasizes the compound nature of the events, right? And I think in our discussions, we said, like, sometimes we think that the natural hazard, that's the event that we're responding to, but sometimes we're responding to years and years of mismanagement and other compounding issues that we need to attend very quickly. But to give you kind of like a brief overview, and I wrote this for that special edition of Population and Environment. So in the last 20 years, the island of Puerto Rico has undergone a series of environmental, social, and economic crises. While the devastation caused by Hurricane Maria in 2017 brought nationwide and international attention to the conditions in Puerto Rico, the island has had a history of exposure to several environmental hazards and risks, including tsunamis, floods, tropical storms, coral reef deterioration, severe drought, and coastal erosion. All indicators of the impact of climate change of the island's ecological infrastructure. In addition to these hazards and risks, Puerto Rico's financial crisis, dating back to the early 2000s, has reduced the capacity to maintain critical energy, healthcare, transportation, and communication structures. This incapacity magnified the impact of Hurricane Maria, resulting in 100% loss of electricity and communication during the critical first days after the hurricane. Years of economic struggles have had serious socioeconomic ramifications that have fueled extensive out-migration to the continental United States. The population of Puerto Rico has decreased from 3.7 million in 2010 to roughly 3 million in 2023, more than 500,000 population loss. The hurricane also exposed the scarcity of population data, issues in collective new data, and to the value of existing administrative and vital records. Puerto Rico's demographic data were limited in demonstrating the effects of the Hurricane Maria's long-term decline in population through either mortality or migration. One of the things I wouldn't be resident, that Hurricane Maria was a turning point for me as well. And I'm putting this quote out here of C. Wright Mills to my fellow sociologists in the crowd, and kind of like this relationship between biography and history and what it guides our work out here. And this leads also to the transboundary crisis turning point that we had. Florida became the response to the center. And it tells you a little bit how things quickly change, right? This was back in 2017. I'll read you sort of the declaration of emergency that the state of Florida put together. The state of emergency, the governor declared a state of emergency in all 67 Florida counties in response to Hurricane Maria's catastrophic impact on Puerto Rico. This declaration will provide important resources and assistance needed to best accommodate the needs of families impacted by Hurricane Maria when they come to Florida. Families displaced by Hurricane Maria are already present and arriving in Florida, and the states must do everything possible to effectively support the Puerto Rico response effort. Florida will continue to coordinate with FEMA to provide Maria survivors who have traveled to the state with important services such as housing assistance, crisis counseling, employment assistance, and legal advice. And how do the times change, right? In terms of that, in just 7 years, we certainly have other turning points. I would say that part of this, and I think what Walt was saying, let's bring some positive discussion to this. I have to say, without Hurricane Maria as a turning point, there's no Puerto Rico Research Hub. And sort of it led to the creation of it, and you can check us out in terms of that. And also it led to what we're starting, the Puerto Rico Disaster Network. We have a poster out here. Some of my students are here that created these things out here, and it's on display out here. And these are kind of like some of the things that are happening out there in terms of that. And I think my time is almost, I have like 30 seconds or so. So thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion, and let's have the conversation now. Thank you.
Oh, what an exciting group of talks, and thanks to each of you, and also for respecting the time boundaries so that we had plenty of time for our conversation. I want to start actually kind of just where we just were with Fernando and talking about the legacies of infrastructure, disinvestment, or the term that you used, which I carefully quoted so that I can attribute it to you, an ongoing stream of disasters, which I would describe as the way that history catches up with us and defines our present moments. Always, I'm a historian, so sorry about that. But I wonder how others of you have encountered those legacies in your own work, legacies which are often disappeared intentionally from all kinds of records, public records, memorial records, even cultural records. And so I guess, Lauren, can I throw that to you first, just to talk a little bit about what Fernando called compounding disaster or an ongoing stream of disaster?
Sure. If you guys can recall that slide with the red dots and the black lines, in 2010, talked about the big oil spill off of Louisiana, so they're cleaning up the oil, and BP was on site, right? And they got some oil, and BP said, oh yeah, that's not our oil. Like, we're gonna clean it up. They're like, that's not our oil. We have sour crude, that's not our oil. Trace back this interloper oil back to a site off of Texas from the Taylor Oil Company. And what happened was in 2002, 2001, the Taylor Oil Company legally, lawfully, sealed one of its wells. Followed the law, said we're done producing, we are sealing it, certified, all done, check. Hurricane Katrina had another idea. Hurricane Katrina came in, created this submarine landslide, scraped the top off the Taylor oil spill. And in that period of time, the Taylor oil well started to leak. But no one was paying attention to it because it's a couple miles offshore, right? 5 years later, BP's like, not our oil, trace it back. It's been leaking since then. It is the largest oil spill in the United States. No one's ever heard of it. And it was just kept considered sealed in 2022. So when I look at that map with the red dots and the black lines, the Taylors didn't really do anything wrong. They did their job, they made their money, they sealed it, they moved on, and yet we have all that legacy infrastructure in the bottom of that water. Hurricane Katrina, another one, took another pipeline, 1 mile of pipeline, linear mile pipeline, moved it 11 miles off its pipe, right? So now you have 3 pipes, not 1. And this happens over and over again when you think of 2017, you think of 2020, you think of all these seasons of rapidly accelerating powerful hurricanes. What is it doing to the infrastructure we can't see? And we may not know about it until the next major oil company says, that's not my oil.
Fernando, can I bring that back to you since you introduced the compound disaster concept? Because, and we can get in the weeds about research, right? So the variables are hard to keep track of or even define. These kind of multivariate problems, and then you start tracking them over space and time. I'm not going to ask you to solve that for me in the next 30 seconds, but could you? Like, how do you even imagine? We use that term, it's a powerful term, but I don't know where to draw the boundaries.
Well, I mean, the definition is, more or 2 hazards that are continuous or, continue to pile on in terms of that. I think Hurricane Maria demonstrated, sort of the legacy of this continuous streams of disasters out here. And it brought attention to the territories that sometimes we don't pay attention to, which is a great concept as well. But as we can see, right, it's kind of like those unhidden type of things that we don't necessarily are in the eye of the imagination out here in terms of that. So there's different ways to define it. I'm not saying that this is the only example of compounding disasters, right? I think, and the U.S. Geological Service is going to have a compounding disaster meeting in Portland soon, and we're going to discuss some of the issues as well in terms of that. Because it could be an issue of time, continuity, and just sort of, sometimes we have it in rapid succession, that is more than one. But I think in a way it also challenges us as researchers, because we used to think about, disasters as single entities, right? Oh, I do this, I do hurricanes, I do tsunamis, I do volcanoes, and I think we're moving the field on, and there's a large legacy of that, right? Kind of like the all hazard system and all those type of things. But more and more, we need to start imagining the unimaginable as the norm, right? That is not going to be a simple type of hazard that is going to turn into a disaster. It might be in very quick sequence. It could be, one here, one there. But we're seeing more extreme events, and I think that's a big legacy in terms of looking at. I think in almost all the disasters we discuss, in terms of turning points and what is going to be the future out here, looking 50 years forward out there, and kind of like looking at those enduring consequences of disasters as a field.
Let me just stay with that, because I think to me it opens up the possibility that when you focus on one type of disaster, and these types, we have to use them, we inherit them, natural disaster, a technological disaster, a public health disaster. But I'm curious how, in your own work, when you dive deep into one of those, what it might illuminate about other types or the problem of the typologies. And I mean, for example, Lauren, focusing on an oil spill, but what does that illuminate in other domains of disaster research that might not be ordinarily bounded in the boom?
Well, I have the privilege of working in the Gulf region, which is no stranger to all kinds of disasters. And there is no single event. This is, these are overlapping recoveries, they're incomplete recoveries before the next one happens. And so this notion that we can look at a single event as a generational event and that'll never happen again, it just doesn't hold where I work, where you live, where Walt lives. It just doesn't hold because the frequency is such that they are complex. One does relate to another. Grand Bayou, Grand Isle, the same places that got hit by Katrina, got hit by Ida, were where the oil came on shore. These people, and you lived through all of that, and I think that that's really expressed in that graveyard image, that it's not just that they might have lost their job, they lost their food, they lost their parts of their culture and what they did. So there's all these layers to something that, to a region or a place or a people who are constantly and repeatedly put under duress.
I want to riff off of Kathleen Tierney's really powerful opening remarks, and we've got to talk about government, and we've got to talk about politics. Everybody's already been talking about these things. And particularly this sort of idea of it, you talked about elite panic, Kathleen, and the way you structured your opening. I love the scalar aspect from the local and what these members of this community did at the local level to state and then up to federal, where you didn't hold back. And there's no dancing around the fact that disasters are political. They exist in a political system. But whatever the macro politics of the day, I'm just going to editorialize for 5 seconds. This community always makes new knowledge. You are always getting down to work. The workforce might be forced to change in light of political events of the day, but I'm always astounded at how much this community just keeps going. And I started making a list, preparing for this, of moments of political turmoil in the history of the disaster research community going back to the 1950s. And I wrote 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and then I stopped. But I did want to, see if you might, and Walt, I'm going to ask you this first, how you might just think about how disaster research functions in times of political turmoil.
Yeah.
Take a beat, Walt.
Yeah, right. We have a history of lots of changes and the politics of things. We also have a history of events that shape and open windows of opportunities as well, too. I mean, we can see it now with what's happened in Texas. All of a sudden, FEMA may be back on the table, thank God, hopefully that will continue. But so those things change. We do have these events that will shape the future. And I guess the thing that concerns me the most right now is just the potential, not just the loss of funding, but the loss of institutional memory, the loss of the ideas that are so important that shape where we need to be going. You know, I mean, I think most of y'all know I spent a couple years at NSF, and I am scared to death about what's happening there. The IPAs are not there anymore. Many of the, the permanent folks are not there anymore and stuff. So it's incumbent upon us to keep the proposals going in, to keep the ideas there, and to be helping each other, especially older people like me, helping the younger folks, because I do really worry about the younger folks and the expectations for funding, the expectations to keep the research going. So, you know, when we did the Hurricane Andrew stuff, it was lots of small grants that kind of kept that going, and we're may well be in that phase now and working more closely with locals and local opportunities that can make that and potentially keep that happen, and not allow ourselves to be fragmented and to be internally competitive. I mean, we've had. I can remember when I would do NSF stuff, and I'd had to write why a hurricane is important for earthquakes, right? And
Right.
Dennis would say, Walt, I need this, so, and then, Hurricane Andrew happened. It was like, wind, oh no, we don't need to be funding wind. And, people recognize, yeah, we do need to be funding wind and stuff. But then the earthquake community was, so there was a lot of divisions there, and we cannot allow that to happen again. We really do need to be moving together as a community and helping ensure, and especially the younger folks, helping them survive what's happening. I've been contacted by so many younger folks saying, should I keep doing equity work? Should I keep doing it? Hell yes. Maybe change the language some. I mean, I can remember, sustainability was the big issue, and then we couldn't get funding with sustainability. I remember spending with Margaret Davison, salons with Margaret Davison, coming up with resilience, and as a bit more politically opportune term to use that maybe would slide through, and so we're going to have to play with some of those issues as well. But if we give up, we will lose it. And if we fragment, we will lose it as well. And we have got to retain that memory and push those things when the opportunities arise to kind of bring those things back in terms of deciding where that funding goes and why that interdisciplinary approach is going to be so critical as well, too, and stuff. So anyway, sorry. I hope.
No, Kathleen, you opened this line of conversation for us. Do you want to, sort of respond to anything that Walt said about that, or offer your own, sort of bring us back to that moment in time that you were talking about post 9/11? There was a lot of research money that poured into this community in that moment. So if you just looked at it from the outside, you might say, wow, golden age.
Yeah, I really agree with the points that you're making. And, one of the things that I wanted to do with my presentation on 9/11 was to talk about policy responses that are highly counterproductive, as I think many of them were after 9/11, with the just overly bloated emphasis on the potential for terrorist attacks. And, we're living through a time right now when we're also seeing extreme policy responses in so many different sectors. And I almost compare the preoccupation with terrorism with our current preoccupation with immigration, where funds are being taken away from other endeavors that are very, very important, such as disaster loss reduction, to channel them into what analysts are really saying is an extreme reaction to our immigration crisis or our immigration issues. And we, again, harking back to what Ed Conley said earlier in his talk, we have no choice but to hope. We have no choice but to see this particular moment in time as something that will hopefully pass, and hopefully pass soon, to get things back on an even keel, on an even kilter, as they should be. But we're in a time where lots of actions are being taken that are highly, highly misguided, highly damaging to our institutions, to our science, and following up on what Walt had to say, to the next generation. We must hope, we must work, we must coordinate and collaborate even more than ever before.
The moment that you're describing also after 9/11, Kathleen, I just want to circle back. You said it very quickly at the end, but I want to highlight that you testified before Congress. I mean, you took lots of actions, and then you also facilitated what I see as actually expanding a bigger tent for disaster research. Security studies, terrorism studies, homeland security studies moved, I think, quite central into areas of research where they had been there, but not as central, obviously. And I wonder, so, if we're looking for that period as like, what kind of action could I take as a researcher to try to shape the policy environment? I think you modeled a lot of things that a person can do. And I wanted to give everybody else, if you want to address that, as you think, well, I mean, yeah, I'm going to get down and do my research, but what else? If there's time for anything else, can we be doing to take action? And I'm not diminishing publishing peer-reviewed monographs, historical monographs, as a form of taking action, but there's many other types of actions that can be taken, and I see lots of hands. So Shirley, I saw you first, and then I'll come to Lauren.
Yes, I think, testing, okay.
Yeah.
Those of us who are old had a time when we were hippies, like Chris down here, Los Angeles. And we thought we accomplished some good things in those years. But we forgot to test whether what we accomplished would hold. And I'm very fearful. First, I think Walt would acknowledge we don't just want to go back, we want to evolve. But as we do so, we need to be more careful of making sure that the directions we find ourselves in are going to be that which is needed and then secured, because we didn't do that.
Lauren?
The Gulf Research Program has this money, and the money has to go to the people and the places that suffered the injury of the oil spill, which is the Gulf Coast. And beyond that, we have very few restrictions on this money. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is to encourage science and research to be done a little bit differently. Now, this doesn't apply to everybody and for all things, but for our remit, which is to enhance offshore energy, enhance environmental protection, and enhance the health and the resilience of the communities of the Gulf, it actually works pretty well. And so one of the pieces about what does this mean for research, a turning point for research, is we're funding like consortia, research, right? That we're looking at, for example, the Mississippi River and the delta that's sinking, and that's not alarm because all deltas sink, right? Eric Tate, for those of us who are hydrologists and pluvial geometry, all deltas sink, but it matters in that delta, whether it sinks quickly from the ocean in, from the west to the east, because there's navigation, because there's oil and gas, because there's seafood. These are the things that make this region a national priority, contributing some 25% from that Gulf of America to the US GDP every single year, so it matters. And so this piece about the research and how to do it a little bit differently, we have a lot of consortia. So on something like the Mississippi, we have the modelers, but we also have the river managers. We have the Army Corps, we have the end users, we have the fishermen, we have the navigation people saying, let me get my input into the research as it's being done so that when the research is done, I can use it. And I can know that I can pick it up and use it because I had a say in it, my community was represented in it. So there's that, and that really works in an applied situation, and it works really well when you have a place-based set of questions, because then you can get that consortia that has a common agenda for a common place. So that doesn't work for everybody, but that's one of the things that we're experimenting with. And thus far, we've been very pleased with the results.
Yeah, thank you for that very concrete, demonstration of how what action might look like at different scales. I want to just shift gears for a second and we took the temperature of the room, and the question for you, the question to the panelists was, what do you see as a disaster that was a real a pivot point for this community, this research community, and Hurricane Maria, COVID, September 11, the Tohoku triple disaster, Superstorm Sandy, the Camp Fire, the Kerr County floods, Hurricane Betsy, Hurricane Andrew, the Portsmouth Fire of 1803, thank you. I don't know who you are, I won't ask you to raise your hand, but talk to me after. Surely, Hurricane Katrina, out of those 38 people who fed back, 20 said Hurricane Katrina was the pivot point. So I want to bring it back to you. I think you've now earned the chance to extend your remarks, and particularly because of the work that you have done and you're doing now. Can you go a little deeper into the way, so first of all, why do 20 out of 38 people think Katrina is so important, but also what does it tell us not just about academic research, but the role of community-based action, community-led research, community research partnerships? Can you just take us a little further down that road, please?
After my academic career, I was a vice president of research at the University of New Orleans, and it enabled me to do an applied center, which at that time was, no, you only do basic research. When I retired, with Christina Peterson, we created the Lowlander Center, and we are so immersed in what you're talking about. I can't finally retire, just can't do it, But what we've learned, I believe, is that you have to include everyone, include the whole community, include the community level, not just the state officials. Sometimes state officials don't make the right decisions for the communities they represent. And so the better you get at partnering with communities to support their ability to take the steps they need to take to be safe, the better the whole picture is. It's sort of like what Lauren's saying in terms of regionalism. Well, this is community-based. And I just can't advocate strongly enough to empower. That's basically. We have the First Peoples Tribal Council, which functions for 6 tribes. And I think I need to continue sitting next to people at meetings, because this one I found at North Dakota, Idaho, when the rural sociology meetings met there 11 years ago. I sat next to an indigenous woman who had this remarkable relationship with the U.S. Ag, and was
doing really, really good community work with regard to resilience. And that has changed our world completely. She told me about it. We brought the USDA folks down who were doing it, and it has empowered 6 tribes. It's open to any tribe in the state of Louisiana, but the difference is just remarkable. So don't give up on the local communities. Don't give up on asking in the work that you do, what are the things that you can do to build their capacity? Because I really do think that local community level is critical to the future.
Well, those connections don't always work. And I think, Shirley, you were talking earlier about, having something that you think is established and then time passes and maybe the infrastructure that we thought was there between community-based organizations, nonprofits, VOAD groups, and academic researchers, the whole apparatus, including policy, is not as strong as we thought it was. I want to hear more, actually, from you, maybe even advising us based on your experience, how we strengthen those ties, or what kind of new ideas, maybe that you've never spoken about before, that you're going to give us here this morning, Lauren?
I just want to respond to the group's zeitgeist here about Katrina. We're working in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida, where Katrina left its mark. 20 years later, we are still tripping over Katrina. And this particular event, in my view, would be the watershed event. It kind of stirred up all of this resilience movement. The Rockefeller Foundation said 100 resilient cities. They started in New Orleans. I would also just say that Katrina was a media turning point as well. Nobody wants Anderson Cooper coming to their city after an event because he stood in front of the Superdome and said, look what we do to our poor, our black, our disenfranchised. And everyone around the world saw that. I was working in Africa at the time. They're like, is that really what happens in the United States? I was like, well, yeah. So one was a media turning point, and Anderson Cooper standing out there in hurricanes, like he changed all of that. And the second thing I would say as a turning point for Katrina was that it was a political disaster. Every politician in elected office lost their job, lost their patina in George Bush's case. People who loved him was even like, yeah, but Katrina, or went to jail. So I think that those things, really set a new tone for what do we do in disasters, who's going to cover it, how do we talk about it, and who will be held accountable. And I think that those are the recurring pieces of why I think Katrina was the watershed moment.
Anybody else want to comment on any part of that, either the community piece or why Katrina matters so much? I think everybody does. Kathleen and then Fernando.
Well, Lauren, you said that Katrina was a political disaster. I think we're seeing the Texas floods of July 4th as a maybe smaller scale, certainly smaller scale in terms of damage and loss of life, but also an event that is causing us, the general public, the media, political figures, et cetera, causing us to say, hey, there's a breakdown here somewhere. There's some real issues somewhere. I mean, here, and that people are beginning to question this idea of phasing FEMA out. People are beginning to question, what is a warning system? A warning system is not simply a warning technology or something that goes off on your phone. It is a socio-technical system in which local officials, the general public, state officials have a role to play. You don't just throw out a message, right? So we're sort of seeing on a smaller scale the kind of breakdown of the emergency management system in the July 4th event that we saw in Katrina, even in terms of the federal level response.
Yeah, kind of like wrapping it up in terms of things that we can do and some of the warnings and the challenges. I think we need to do this, right? This right now, right? This room right now, in terms of building those relationships, right? But we have to be careful with the relationships as well, right? Sometimes we get caught up with the social media, and we need to go beyond the headlines, right? Because that cannot be our only source of information. And something resonated this morning when Ed Conley was saying, you know, we need to not underestimate communities or systems or procedures and all sort of stuff, because we tend to do that, right? And we tend to kind of like throw money at the problem, and this is what you need to do, and this is what you need to do. But we need to reflect a little bit. You know, think about the resiliency of all the people that have been involved in all these disasters that we highlighted here, but the many that are happening every single day, right? There's a formula out there that we need to explore a little bit more. You know, sort of highlight sometimes, but not too much, because sometimes there's unintended consequences, right? When we highlight a community group that then all of a sudden have to address an Anderson Cooper coming with the CNN crew while they're doing research that they're doing work that is important, right? And I think that's some of the issues out there. And, you know, one of the things, like, you know, if you think about what happened after Hurricane Maria and the response in Puerto Rico for COVID-19, you know, those went hand in hand, right? And usually when you give the same level of resources, and when I'm talking resources, it's not only monetary resources, but attention, access, information, all those type of things, it can make a big difference out here. And I think we need to sometimes be careful that we not continue to underestimate ourselves, but also the communities we work with.
Walt, you're holding the mic. But yeah, let's take that.
Yeah, I do think working with and through local communities can be important, and you can get beyond the politics, especially when events happen. You don't have to talk about climate change. You don't have to talk about, you know, I mean, you can talk about the issues, how we address the recovery, how we address warning, et cetera, and there's a real opportunity to kind of make a change there, and to facilitate what's helping local as well too, which also is going to demand a hell of a lot more commitment on all of our parts as well too. I mean, doing that work at that local level really demands being out there a lot more than right after the event happens as well. And I think it's something that we need to be thinking about when an event does happen. I know something, you know, after Andrew, one of the things that, you know, we talked about, you know, there are local universities, researchers, et cetera, that are there, and then they're dealing with, you know, their own recovery. And other folks then are coming in and, you know, I don't want to say taking advantage, but taking advantage of that situation. And so I think we need to be appreciative of what's happening and work through our colleagues that are at the local level as well too, and facilitate what they can do. I remember after Katrina, you know, getting in touch with, you know, we took. The university took in many students from UNO and really tried to kind of help them do what they needed to do to be successful, and not running to NSF and getting the funding to, yeah. So I think we need to be cognizant of that as well too, and use that opportunity to, again, build the social infrastructure of our research community and help others as well.
I want to shine some light back on all of you. Some of the answers that we got, people reflected on how these turning point disasters shaped your careers, but also your life. One person shared, my extended family was affected by the 2011 Tohoku triple disaster. Another said, I had to navigate return to work with colleagues experiencing PTSD with little or no help or support from an employer. Another said, COVID launched my career, but I felt like a war profiteer. It was important analysis work. What an amazing insight. Another says, I came back from Katrina after a 4-month Mississippi deployment full of learning, inspiration, and severe PTSD. Another said, working in the field humbles you. It makes you more human. It provides greater perspective on life. Another said, I have wildland firefighters in my immediate family, and now I get to study wildfire. Another said, it's led me to switch from physical science to social science. You can still do both. Another said, the 2020 Labor Day fires, professionally and personally, and the 1987 SLC floods personally affected me. The Camp Fire made risk and emergency management a priority, another says. Another says, growing up in southern Louisiana means reckoning early on with disaster and our contributions. Another says, these molded my understanding of value of ecological and natural systems in hazard mitigation. We have a couple of minutes left. I want to give the panel, if you wanted to react to anything you just heard, or if you had something that you wanted to say and I rudely moved past something you wanted to say, let me bring you back into the highway here and share your idea. Shirley?
I think that, oops, there we go, my mic. Those of you who are applied, I really think we have to be more attentive to observing the pieces of the successes. In other words, just don't do what you can do and go on. Say, how did what I do or what others do or the group do enhance the success? Keep on asking that. To use a simple phrase, what's the R squared of the success of the topic and the behavior that you're doing? Don't step back. Always be a researcher as you are an applied person. I really feel strongly about that.
Other feedback on what you heard or just anything else you wanted to share? We've got about a minute left to wrap up.
Maybe it works.
There you go.
There we go. Okay. I guess I just want to say, it's a difficult time, and we need to pull together to kind of go through that, to go through this together and hopefully come out stronger at the end. But there is going to be an awful lot of groundwork that needs to be redeveloped there as well, too. So I think we need to be willing to roll up our sleeves, sacrifice, rather than getting 10 publications out this year, maybe 2 or 3 is okay, and doing something that actually can make a difference to the community as well, too, and to be to facilitate that change and to facilitate our resilience as well, too. So let's work together to make that happen.
And I want to co-sign something that Fernando said. It has come up in many different ways. And I did a podcast for 2 years about COVID and talked to many of you every day for 2 years. Conversation matters. Network that you're building, even by sitting in this room this morning, matters. Participating in this conversation changes you. Everybody here probably came away with at least one. I had about 8 quotes here to take back to your own work. And I think I'm just so impressed and so happy that we were able to help facilitate another space where people could share about your own experience, but also, be open to hearing from others, hearing from you, and learning. So I would just want to take this moment to invite all of you to join me in thanking Walt Peacock and Kathleen Tierney, Shirley Laska, Lauren Alexander Augustine, and Fernando Rivera for being great people, great researchers, great community leaders, and great leaders in this community. Thanks to each of you.
And Scott, right on time. And in addition to thanking Kathleen, Fernando, Walt, Shirley, and Lauren for your wisdom and insights, your commitment to this field, making this field possible, we also want to thank Scott Knowles for your moderating. And for the 2 years of your life that you gave to COVID calls and to listening to people, uplifting survivors' voices, researchers' voices, responders' voices, and never losing sight of that, the most deadly disaster of our modern time, and keeping it front and center for so many. So thank you. And thank you to all of you for your listening and your attention and your care, and for the ways that you have helped turn this field and steer it forward, and the work that is ahead of us that you are going to play a central role in. Right now, we are going to take an hour-and-a-half break. A hallmark of the workshop is that we have long breaks, a long lunch period, so that people have time to continue conversations, to start new ones, and to ultimately to make new friends and to recommit to old relationships. So we're going to take a lunch break. Before we do that, though, a few quick important announcements. At